Elena collapsed on the cold airport bench, her wedding dress torn and mascara streaking down her cheeks. A stranger's coat settled over her shoulders like a whisper. What she didn't know was that the vampire king had been hunting for centuries for someone brave enough to run from their own cage. The crystal chandeliers cast shadows across marble floors as Elena moved through the wedding reception like a ghost in white silk. Every smile felt painted on her face, every congratulation another weight pressing down on her chest. Marcus stood beside the champagne fountain, his hand possessive on her lower back, fingers digging just deep enough to remind her who owned this moment. The guests swirled around them in expensive fabrics and practiced laughter, but Elena heard only the thundering of her own heartbeat against her ribs. She had signed her name in the register 2 hours ago, watched the gold band slide onto her finger, felt the trap click shut with the finality of a vault door sealing. 2 years of careful manipulation had led to this moment. 2 years of Marcus slowly cutting away every thread that connected her to her old life, until only he remained. Her father's newspaper had been drowning in debt when Marcus appeared like a savior, offering investment in exchange for her hand. Not literally, of course. Marcus was too sophisticated for such crude transactions. Instead, he courted her with flowers and expensive dinners, all while quietly buying up her father's creditors, ensuring that refusal would mean financial ruin for the only family she had left. Her friends had grown distant after Marcus began monitoring her phone calls. After he started insisting she was too good for her old crowd, after he convinced her that her journalism degree was cute but unnecessary when he could provide everything she needed. The isolation had been gradual, surgical, precise. Each severed connection disguised as protection, as love, as his desire to give her the best life possible. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Elena had felt herself disappearing piece by piece, her voice growing smaller in conversations, her opinions mattering less and less until she barely remembered what she thought about anything anymore. But tonight, something had cracked. She had stepped away from the reception to find a quiet bathroom, her dress trailing behind her like chains, when she heard Marcus speaking on his phone in the adjacent corridor. His voice carried the same tone he used when discussing stock portfolios or real estate acquisitions, cold and calculating. He was talking about their honeymoon, about the tragic accident he had arranged, about how much her life insurance policy would net him after a respectable mourning period. The words hit her like ice water. She pressed herself against the wall, silk rustling against marble, and listened to her husband plan her murder with the same detached efficiency he brought to board meetings. Her hands shook as she heard him discuss the boat, the storm that would conveniently arise, the way her body would never be recovered from those particular waters. He even mentioned how he would console her father, how he would keep the newspaper running in her memory, how the grieving widower would eventually find love again with someone more suitable to his long-term plans. Elena had known Marcus was controlling, possessive, cold beneath his polished exterior, but she had never imagined he was capable of this level of calculation. The conversation lasted only minutes, but it shattered every remaining illusion she had held about her marriage, about Marcus, about the life she thought she was accepting. When he ended the call and returned to the reception, Elena remained frozen in that corridor, her mind racing through possibilities and finding only one clear path. She had to run, now, tonight, before the honeymoon, before the boat, before she became another casualty of Marcus Blackwood's ambition. Her escape began in the ladies' room, where she tore away the worst of the dress train and stuffed her jewelry into her purse. The pearls and diamonds would be traceable, but they might buy her time or transportation if she could find the right buyer. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, asking where she was, and Elena realized she had perhaps minutes before he came looking for her. The service entrance led through the kitchen, where catering staff barely glanced at the brides stumbling past their prep stations. The alley behind the hotel reeked of garbage and stale cigarettes, but Elena had never breathed air that tasted so much like freedom. She flagged down a taxi with shaking hands, giving the driver the address of the airport, without any clear plan beyond getting as far away as possible before Marcus discovered her absence. The wedding dress drew stares in the airport terminal, but Elena discovered that people assumed a woman in formal wear was simply traveling to or from some important event. No one questioned her right to be there. No one asked uncomfortable questions about why she looked like she had been crying. The anonymity felt like a blessing after 2 years of Marcus knowing her location every moment of every day. She bought a ticket to Denver with cash from her purse, choosing the destination because it was the next flight departing and because she had never expressed any interest in Colorado to Marcus. The gate area was nearly empty at this hour, just a few business travelers and a handful of red-eye passengers trying to sleep in uncomfortable chairs. Elena found a bench in a quiet corner and sat down heavily, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving her exhausted and shaking. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts from Marcus, each message growing more frantic and threatening. She turned it off and removed the battery, having read enough thrillers to know that phones could be tracked. The airport felt like a refuge, a space between worlds where she could exist without being anyone's wife or daughter or possession. But as the hours passed, Elena began to realize how thoroughly unprepared she was for life on the run. She had credit cards that Marcus could track, a phone that had to stay dead, and less than $300 in cash. Worse, she had nowhere to go even if she made it to Denver. Marcus had systematically eliminated every support system she might have turned to. Every friend who might have offered a couch to sleep on or a loan to tide her over. She was completely alone in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. The terminal grew quieter as midnight approached, the shops closing one by one until only the occasional janitor or security guard moved through the corridors. Elena curled up on the hard bench, using her purse as a pillow and wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The wedding dress provided little protection against the aggressive air conditioning, and she found herself shivering despite her emotional numbness. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of late flights and early departures, by the constant worry that Marcus had somehow tracked her down, by the growing realization that she had traded certain death for an uncertain and potentially very difficult future. But even as exhaustion and fear clouded her thoughts, Elena felt something she had not experienced in 2 years. She had made a choice. Not the choice Marcus wanted, not the choice that would make her father happy, not the choice that would preserve anyone else's plans or dreams or financial interests. She had chosen herself, chosen survival, chosen the unknown over the certainty of being destroyed. The Vampire King had been watching her for hours before he finally approached. Adrian Dracule moved through the airport terminal like shadow made flesh, drawing no attention from security cameras or human eyes. 3 centuries of existence had taught him to observe without being observed, to study humanity from a distance that preserved both their safety and his secrecy. But this woman in the torn wedding dress called to something he had thought long dead in his immortal heart. He had seen desperate humans before, had watched them make terrible choices and good ones with equal fascination. But Elena's courage struck him as something rare and precious. She had not merely run from danger, she had run toward an uncertain future, with nothing but her own determination as protection. Adrian understood the weight of such choices, the cost of trading known suffering for unknown possibilities. His own existence was a testament to the price of choosing freedom over security, though his cage had been built from duty and ancient laws rather than human manipulation. He approached while she slept, moving with the supernatural silence that allowed him to exist undetected among mortals. Elena looked fragile, curled on the hard bench, her dress torn and her makeup streaked with tears, but Adrian sensed the steel beneath her vulnerability. Her dreams were troubled, full of shadows and threats, but also shot through with fierce determination. When he draped his coat over her sleeping form, Adrian allowed himself the briefest moment of physical contact. His supernatural senses caught fragments of her recent memories, images of fear and control, and the moment she chose to save herself. The experience left him shaken in ways he had not felt for decades. This woman had broken free from her golden cage through sheer force of will, and her courage awakened something in Adrian that felt dangerously close to hope. He retreated to the shadows to watch over her sleep, knowing that he had already crossed a line he had maintained for centuries. The Vampire King was not supposed to involve himself in human affairs, was not supposed to feel anything but detached curiosity about mortal struggles. But Elena's bravery had touched something ancient and hungry in his immortal soul, something that whispered of possibilities he had long ago abandoned as impossible dreams. Elena stirred from restless sleep as dawn light filtered through the terminal windows, her body aching from the hard bench and her mind still foggy with exhaustion. The coat that covered her was expensive, tailored from fabric so fine it felt like liquid against her skin, and it carried the scent of winter nights and something else she could not identify. Beside her on the bench lay a sleek black phone she had never seen before, its screen displaying a single message that made her heart skip with equal parts hope and terror. "You are not alone." The initial A offered no explanation, no context, just the promise that someone in this vast anonymous space had noticed her plight and chosen to act. Elena clutched the phone with trembling fingers, her journalistic instincts warring with her desperate need to believe that help had arrived from an unexpected source. The terminal buzzed with morning travelers, coffee shops opening and departure boards updating with new flights, but Elena felt suspended outside the normal flow of human activity. She wrapped the mysterious coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to process the implications of the message. Someone had been watching her, had seen her vulnerability, had access to prepaid phones and expensive clothing. The possibilities ranged from guardian angel to potential threat, and Elena realized she had no way to distinguish between the two in her current state. Her wedding dress drew curious glances from passers-by, but Elena discovered that most people preferred not to stare too directly at obvious distress. She made her way to the nearest bathroom, using the harsh fluorescent lighting to assess the damage from her night of escape. Her makeup had run in black streaks down her cheeks, her hair had escaped its elaborate styling, and the dress that had cost more than most people made in a month looked like she had worn it to climb fences and run through alleys. The reflection staring back at her looked like a stranger. Someone wild and desperate and free in ways that frightened and exhilarated her simultaneously. When Elena emerged from the bathroom, she immediately sensed the change in the terminal atmosphere. Men in dark suits moved through the corridors with the purposeful stride of private security, their eyes scanning faces with professional thoroughness. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead figure, Marcus's head of security, a man whose background Elena had never been allowed to investigate, but whose presence always made her skin crawl. They were here, had found her somehow despite her precautions, and Elena realized that her husband's resources extended far beyond what she had imagined possible. She ducked behind a pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the security team spread out through the terminal with military precision. The mysterious phone buzzed in her hand, displaying a new message that made her look up sharply. Gate 27. Now. The instruction came without explanation, but Elena found herself moving before her conscious mind had decided to trust this unknown benefactor. Gate 27 was in a quieter section of the terminal, past the main shopping area, and into a corridor lined with business-class lounges. Elena walked as quickly as she dared without drawing attention, the wedding dress making stealth impossible but desperation, lending her a strange confidence. She felt eyes on her as she moved, but when she glanced around, she could not identify the source of her unease. The gate area was nearly empty, just a few passengers waiting for an early flight to Seattle, and a custodian mopping the floor with methodical precision. Elena took a seat facing the corridor, positioning herself so she could watch for Marcus's men while appearing to study the departure information. The mysterious coat still wrapped around her shoulders felt like armor, expensive and protective in ways she could not articulate. She was examining the phone for more messages when a shadow fell across her seat, and Elena looked up to find herself staring at the most beautiful man she had ever seen. He was tall and lean with pale skin that seemed to glow under the harsh terminal lighting, dark hair that caught the artificial illumination like silk, and eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the fluorescent glare. His features were sharp and aristocratic, as if carved from marble by a master sculptor, but it was his absolute stillness that struck Elena most forcefully. He stood without the small fidgets and adjustments that characterize normal human posture, without the subtle movements that indicated breathing or heartbeat. Everything about him suggested immense control held in perfect check. "You received my message," he said, and his voice carried an accent Elena could not place, something old-world and elegant that made her think of European nobility and ancient castles. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and noticed that his smile revealed teeth that were perhaps too sharp and too white. "I am Adrian," he continued, settling into the seat beside her with fluid grace that seemed almost liquid. "You are in danger, though I suspect you already know this." His proximity made Elena aware of several disturbing details her exhaustion had initially overlooked. Adrian cast no reflection in the polished surface of the gate desk. His pale skin showed no signs of the harsh lighting that made everyone else look sickly, and other passengers seemed to unconsciously avoid looking directly at him. When a family with children walked past their seating area, the youngest child began to cry for no apparent reason, and the parents hurried away with apologetic murmurs. Elena had spent 2 years learning to read subtle signs of danger, and every instinct she possessed screamed that Adrian was not entirely human. But he had helped her when no one else had even noticed her distress, and Marcus's security team was still searching the terminal with growing urgency. Elena found herself caught between multiple impossible situations, forced to choose between known threats and unknown protection. "Can you help me?" she asked, the words coming out as barely a whisper. Adrian studied her face with an intensity that made Elena feel like he was reading thoughts she had not yet formed. His dark eyes seemed to hold depths that stretched far beyond what should have been possible in human features. "Yes," he said finally. "But you must understand that accepting my help comes with consequences you cannot yet comprehend. There are old laws about protection and consent, ancient rules that bind those like me when we choose to intervene in mortal affairs." Elena wanted to ask what he meant by those like me, but Marcus's security chief appeared at the far end of the corridor, his gaze sweeping the gate areas with mechanical precision. Adrian noticed her terror and rose smoothly from his seat, positioning himself so that Elena was shielded from view. "Trust me," he said, and something in his voice compelled obedience despite every rational thought screaming warnings in Elena's mind. The security chief's gaze passed over their seating area without pausing, as if Adrian and Elena were simply not there to be seen. Elena watched in amazement as the man walked directly past them, his eyes unfocused and his expression slightly confused. The other security team members showed similar symptoms, wandering through the gate area like people searching for something they could not quite remember. Within minutes, they had moved on to other sections of the terminal, leaving Elena and Adrian alone in their quiet corner. "What did you do?" Elena asked, but Adrian was already moving, taking her hand with surprising gentleness and guiding her toward a service corridor she had not noticed before. The touch of his skin against hers was shockingly cold, as if he had been standing in winter weather rather than the climate-controlled terminal. "This way," he said, and Elena found herself following without further questions, the mysterious coat still wrapped around her shoulders and the wedding dress trailing behind her like a symbol of the life she was leaving behind, step by step. The service corridor led through areas of the airport Elena had never seen, maintenance spaces, and employee break rooms that existed behind the polished facade presented to travelers. Adrian moved through these spaces with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the building, and Elena began to suspect that his connection to this place ran deeper than simple familiarity. They emerged into what appeared to be a private lounge, elegantly appointed with leather furniture and subdued lighting that felt more like an expensive hotel suite than an airport facility. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the runway, where planes took off and landed in the early morning light with ballet-like precision. Elena sank into one of the leather chairs, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline, and Adrian settled across from her with that same unnatural stillness. "Now we can speak properly," he said, and Elena noticed that his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. She wrapped the mysterious coat tighter around herself and tried to organize the dozens of questions crowding her mind. "Who are you?" she asked finally. Adrian smiled, and Elena caught another glimpse of those two sharp teeth. "Someone who has been watching you for longer than you might find comfortable," he replied. "Your father's newspaper has been struggling for months, and your husband's involvement in its potential salvation caught my attention through certain business channels. I have been observing your situation with growing concern." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You have been watching me," she repeated, unsure whether to feel grateful or terrified. Adrian nodded. "I own this airline, this airport, and several of the companies that your husband has been acquiring in his expansion efforts. When I realized what kind of man Marcus Blackwood truly was, I began monitoring his activities more closely. Your courage in choosing to escape rather than accept his plans has awakened something in me that I believed long dead." There was something in his tone that suggested meanings beyond his words, depths of experience and emotion that Elena could not begin to fathom. "How old are you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Adrian's smile grew wider, revealing more of those predatory teeth. "Far older than I appear," he said. "Old enough to be bound by laws and customs that predate your civilization, old enough to understand the true cost of the protection I am offering you." Elena felt pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place in her mind, connections her rational journalist training wanted to reject, but that her intuition accepted with growing certainty. The lack of reflection, the supernatural cold of his skin, the way other people unconsciously avoided looking at him, the inhuman stillness and predatory grace. "You are not human," she said, and it was not a question. Adrian inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I am something older, something bound by different rules than those that govern mortal existence. But I am also someone who recognizes courage when I see it, who understands the weight of choosing freedom over security. Your willingness to abandon everything familiar rather than accept destruction has called to something in me that has been dormant for centuries." Elena stared at him, processing implications that threatened to shatter her understanding of reality itself. But even as her mind reeled with the impossibility of the situation, she found herself drawn to the sadness she glimpsed behind his beautiful, inhuman features. Whatever Adrian was, he was lonely in ways that transcended normal human experience, isolated by his very nature from the connections that made existence meaningful. And whatever he was offering her, it came with a price that neither of them fully understood yet. The truth hung between them in the elegant lounge like a sword suspended by silk threads, sharp and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Elena stared at Adrian's beautiful, inhuman features and felt her entire understanding of reality shifting beneath her feet like sand in an earthquake. Everything she had believed about the world, about the boundaries between possible and impossible, crumbled in the face of his casual admission that he was something other than human. But even as her rational mind struggled to process the implications, Elena found herself thinking not of monsters or fairy tales, but of the profound loneliness she glimpsed in his dark eyes. Whatever Adrian was, he had chosen to help her when no one else had even noticed her desperation, had offered protection when she had nowhere else to turn, had seen her courage when everyone else saw only a runaway bride in a torn wedding dress. The sound of voices in the corridor outside the lounge interrupted her spiraling thoughts, sharp, urgent tones that carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Elena recognized Marcus's voice among them, smooth and persuasive as he explained to what sounded like airport security that his disturbed wife had suffered a breakdown and needed to be returned home for her own safety. The lies flowed from his tongue with practiced ease, each word carefully chosen to paint Elena as mentally unstable while positioning himself as the concerned husband dealing with a tragic situation. Adrian rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to the window that overlooked the main terminal, and Elena saw his jaw tighten as he observed whatever was happening below. "They have brought more than security," he said, his voice carrying undertones of anger that made the air in the room seem to vibrate. "Your husband has involved federal agents, claiming you may be involved in some form of terrorist activity or international incident. His reach extends further than either of us anticipated." Elena felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the full scope of Marcus's power and influence. He was not simply a wealthy businessman with good lawyers and political connections. He was someone who could mobilize government resources for personal vendettas, who could turn the entire system against anyone who dared to oppose him. Running from him was not just escaping an abusive marriage. It was challenging someone who operated on a level where normal laws and protections meant nothing. The voices grew closer, and Elena heard footsteps in the corridor that sounded like military boots rather than civilian shoes. Adrian turned from the window, his expression grave in ways that transcended normal human concern. "They will search every private space in this airport," he said. "Your husband has convinced them that you pose a significant security risk, and they have authorization to use whatever force they deem necessary to apprehend you. The protection I can offer through normal means has limits when faced with federal authority." Elena stood on shaking legs, the elegant lounge suddenly feeling like a beautiful trap rather than a sanctuary. "What do you mean by normal means?" she asked, though some part of her already knew the answer would change everything forever. Adrian moved closer, his dark eyes holding depths that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of human experience. "I mean that there are other kinds of protection available, older laws that supersede human authority, ancient compacts that create bonds stronger than any government can break. But accepting such protection comes with a price that cannot be undone, consequences that will follow you for the rest of your existence." The sound of doors being forced open echoed through the corridor, accompanied by shouted orders and the metallic click of weapons being readied. Elena realized she had perhaps minutes before Marcus's federal allies breached the lounge, before she would be dragged back to face whatever punishment he had devised for her defiance. The choice crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity, not between safety and danger, but between two different kinds of existence entirely. "I do not understand what you are offering," she said, her voice steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "But I understand what waits for me if I go back to him. Death disguised as accidents, a life that was never really mine, years of being slowly erased until nothing remained but what Marcus wanted me to be. Whatever price you are talking about, whatever consequences, they cannot be worse than the certainty of being destroyed by someone who sees me as nothing more than a possession to be discarded when I am no longer useful." Adrian studied her face with an intensity that felt like being examined down to her soul, searching for something she could not name, but desperately hoped he would find. The sounds in the corridor grew louder, closer, more urgent. "You must understand," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. "What I am offering is not simply protection, it is transformation. Accepting it will bind you to my world, to laws and customs and realities that humans were never meant to comprehend. You will gain safety, but you will lose the life you have always known, the possibility of returning to normal existence. Are you certain this is what you choose? The door to the lounge rattled as someone tested the lock, followed by voices discussing the best way to breach it without damaging expensive airport property. Elena felt time running out like sand through her fingers, each second bringing her closer to recapture and the carefully orchestrated destruction Marcus had planned for her. But beyond the immediate terror, she sensed something else in this moment, an opportunity to claim agency over her own existence in ways she had never imagined possible. I choose your protection over his control, she said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised her. I choose whatever consequences come with freedom over the certainty of being destroyed by someone who never saw me as human. I choose you, Adrian, whatever that means, whatever price that carries. The moment the words left her lips, Elena felt the world shift around her like reality reshaping itself according to new rules. The air in the room seemed to thicken and shimmer, charged with energy that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. Adrian's eyes flared with light that was definitely not human, and Elena felt something fundamental change in the space between them, a connection forming that was deeper than physical proximity and more intimate than any bond she had ever experienced. She could suddenly sense his location even when her eyes were closed, could feel emotions that were not her own flowing through her consciousness, like wine through water. There was hunger there, ancient and powerful and carefully controlled, but also something warmer and more complex, protective instincts that transcended normal human affection. The bond settled into place like puzzle pieces clicking together, and Elena realized she could no longer imagine existing without this connection to Adrian, this awareness of his presence that felt more natural than breathing. You have invoked the old law of sanctuary, Adrian said, and his voice carried overtones of power that made the windows vibrate in their frames. You are now under my protection, according to compacts that predate human civilization, bonds that cannot be broken by mortal authority or supernatural interference. Marcus Blackwood no longer has any legal claim over you, by human law or any other. But Elena, you must understand what you have done. You are now my responsibility for eternity, bound to me and to my world in ways that cannot be undone. The protection is absolute, but it comes with requirements you do not yet comprehend. Elena felt the truth of his words settling into her consciousness like sediment in still water. The connection between them pulsed with energy that felt both alien and familiar, carrying information she could not yet process, but somehow understood on instinctive levels. She was no longer entirely human, no longer subject to the limitations and vulnerabilities that had made Marcus's control possible. But she was also no longer free to exist in the world she had always known, bound now to Adrian and whatever ancient powers he represented. The sounds in the corridor stopped abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch that cut off all sound. Elena looked toward the door in confusion, but Adrian nodded with satisfaction. They can no longer find this room, he explained. The sanctuary law creates protections that extend beyond physical space into perception itself. Your husband and his federal allies will search this airport for days without discovering our location, even though we remain exactly where we have always been. You are safe now, Elena, but you are also changed in ways that will take time for you to fully understand. Elena sank back into the leather chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. She could feel Adrian's presence in her mind like a warm, constant flame, could sense his emotional state as clearly as if his thoughts were her own. The hunger was there, controlled but undeniable, along with something that felt remarkably like wonder. After centuries of isolation, of watching human dramas from a distance without involvement, he had found someone brave enough to choose the unknown over the familiar, someone willing to trade human limitations for supernatural possibilities. But beneath the wonder, Elena also sensed responsibility that weighed on Adrian like chains forged from duty and ancient law. He had not simply offered her protection, he had claimed her as his own according to rules that governed beings far older and more powerful than humanity. The sanctuary law protected her absolutely, But it also bound her to a world she could not yet comprehend, to a future that stretched far beyond normal human experience. "You are no longer entirely mortal," Adrian said, settling back into his chair with that supernatural stillness that no longer seemed strange to Elena. "The bond between us has awakened capabilities in you that were always present, but dormant, gifts that will develop as you learn to navigate my world. But you are also no longer free to walk away, to return to the life you knew before. Marcus may be unable to touch you, but you have traded one form of binding for another, albeit one chosen freely rather than imposed through manipulation and control." Elena nodded, understanding flooding through her consciousness as the supernatural bond shared knowledge she had not possessed moments before. She could sense other presences now, ancient and powerful beings who moved through the world hidden from human awareness, bound by laws and customs that maintained delicate balances between mortal and immortal realms. Adrian was not simply inhuman, he was something like royalty among his kind, responsible for maintaining those balances and protecting the secrets that kept both worlds safe from each other. By claiming his protection, Elena had not simply escaped Marcus's control, she had entered a reality where her choices affected the safety and stability of entire populations she had never known existed. The reality of her transformation settled over Elena like a weight she had not anticipated, heavy with implications that stretched far beyond her personal escape from Marcus's control. Through the supernatural bond that now connected her to Adrian, she could sense presences moving through the world that had always existed just beyond human perception, ancient beings who watched mortal affairs with the detached interest of scholars observing laboratory specimens. The vampire world existed in parallel to human society, she realized, hidden in plain sight through centuries of careful concealment and supernatural manipulation. Adrian belonged to something far more complex than she had imagined, a hierarchical structure with laws and customs that predated human civilization and political intrigues that made mortal power struggles seem like children's games. The elegant airport lounge that had seemed like sanctuary now felt like the antechamber to a realm she could barely begin to comprehend, and Elena found herself wondering if she had traded one form of captivity for another, albeit one chosen rather than imposed. Adrian rose from his chair with that fluid grace that no longer seemed merely unusual, but spoke of predatory perfection honed over centuries of existence. The bond between them carried undertones of his emotional state. Concern mixed with something that felt like anticipation, as if he were waiting for her to realize the full magnitude of what she had committed herself to. "You will need to meet the others," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the supernatural connection they now shared. "My decision to invoke the sanctuary law has not gone unnoticed by those who govern our kind, and they will want to assess whether your presence poses a threat to the secrecy we have maintained for millennia." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning as she processed the implications of his words. She had assumed that Adrian's protection meant safety from human threats, but it seemed she had merely traded one set of dangers for another, supernatural hazards that her human understanding could not even properly categorize. Through the bond, she sensed Adrian's own apprehension, not for his personal safety, but for hers, as if he were leading her into a situation where his power and influence might not be sufficient to guarantee her survival. The transition from the airport lounge to Adrian's true domain occurred through means Elena could not entirely follow, passages that seemed to exist in spaces between normal architecture and transportation that defied conventional understanding of physics and geography. She found herself in what appeared to be an ancient castle relocated intact to the modern world. All stone corridors and tapestried walls, but with contemporary amenities seamlessly integrated into medieval grandeur. The juxtaposition of old and new spoke of resources and influence that stretched across centuries, accumulated power that made Marcus's wealth seem trivial by comparison. But it was the inhabitants of this place that truly drove home the reality of what Elena had entered. They moved through the corridors with the same supernatural grace as Adrian, beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman, despite their human appearances. Their eyes followed Elena with predatory interest, assessing her worthiness through senses that could detect vulnerability and deception with preternatural accuracy. She could feel their skepticism through the bond with Adrian, their concern that his attachment to a mortal represented dangerous weakness that could compromise centuries of careful concealment. The first of Adrian's inner circle to address her directly was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, but whose eyes held depths that suggested centuries of experience. Isadora had served Adrian for over 200 years, Elena learned through the supernatural connection, and her loyalty was matched only by her conviction that human entanglements inevitably led to disaster. She studied Elena with unconcealed disdain, taking in the torn wedding dress and the evidence of recent trauma with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly uninteresting specimen. "So this is the mortal who has caused such disruption," Isadora said, her voice carrying accents that predated modern languages. "Adrian, surely you realize the Council will never approve of this breach of protocol. 3 centuries of isolation. And you choose now to involve yourself with human affairs over a runaway bride." Elena felt anger flare within her at the dismissive tone, but Adrian placed a restraining hand on her arm before she could respond. The touch carried information through their bond, warning her that showing emotion would only confirm Isadora's assessment that she was too unstable to be trusted with supernatural secrets. Instead, Elena forced herself to meet the vampire's gaze directly, drawing on the journalistic training that had taught her to interview dangerous subjects without betraying weakness or fear. "I am here because Adrian offered protection when no one else would help," she said, keeping her voice level despite the otherworldly scrutiny. "If that creates problems for your people, perhaps the issue is with systems that value secrecy over preventing murder." Isadora's eyebrows rose in surprise at Elena's directness, but before she could respond, other voices joined the conversation. Elena found herself surrounded by Adrian's inner circle, vampires who had served him for decades or centuries, and who viewed her presence as everything from amusing curiosity to existential threat. Each carried their own assessment of the risks she represented, their own theories about Adrian's motivations, their own concerns about how the Vampire Council would respond to this unprecedented breach of the isolation protocols that had governed their king's behavior for 300 years. Through the conversations swirling around her, Elena began to understand the true scope of Adrian's position within vampire society. He was not simply a powerful individual, but something closer to royalty, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance between vampire and human worlds that allowed both species to coexist without open warfare. His decision to invoke sanctuary law for a human had political ramifications that extended far beyond personal preference, challenging centuries of precedent and threatening to destabilize carefully maintained power structures. The realization that her escape from Marcus had somehow become entangled with supernatural politics made Elena feel dizzy with the complexity of forces now governing her existence. But even as she struggled to process the implications, she found herself drawing strength from the bond with Adrian, sensing his confidence in her ability to navigate these treacherous waters despite her human limitations. The first indication that her old life was not as easily abandoned as she had hoped came in the form of reports filtering through Adrian's extensive surveillance network. Marcus had not accepted her disappearance as permanent defeat, but had instead launched a comprehensive investigation into every aspect of her escape, including the mysterious benefactor who had helped her evade capture at the airport. His resources were vast, and his connections reached into levels of government and law enforcement that Elena had never suspected. But more dangerous than his official authority was his willingness to venture into areas that most humans avoided instinctively. Marcus was investigating Adrian's business empire with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who sensed that conventional explanations were inadequate, probing financial records and corporate structures that had been carefully constructed to hide supernatural involvement in human affairs. Each inquiry brought him closer to discovering evidence that could expose the entire vampire world, information that would shatter the secrecy that protected both species from the chaos that would inevitably follow public revelation of immortal predators living among mortals. Elena watched Adrian receive updates about Marcus's investigation with growing concern, sensing through their bond the weight of responsibility that pressed down on him like physical force. He had spent centuries maintaining the careful balance that allowed vampires to exist undetected among humans, and her single act of desperation threatened to unravel protections that had taken millennia to establish. The guilt was overwhelming, but Adrian's emotional state carried no blame for her choices, only determination to find a solution that would protect both her safety and the supernatural world's continued concealment. The conversation she had been dreading finally occurred in Adrian's private study, a room lined with books that predated printing and artifacts that spoke of influence extending across centuries of human history. Adrian sat behind a desk that had probably been crafted for medieval nobility, but his expression carried the weight of modern concerns as he explained the full scope of the situation Elena's protection had created. Every human I have ever offered sanctuary to has eventually chosen to return to mortality, he said, his voice carrying undertones of old pain that the supernatural bond allowed Elena to feel as if it were her own. The burden of existing in our world, of knowing truths that cannot be shared with those you once loved, of accepting responsibilities that stretch across centuries rather than decades, proves too much for mortal minds to bear. I am offering you immortality, Elena, transformation into something that can truly belong in my world, rather than simply hiding from yours. But I expect that you will eventually make the same choice as all the others, that you will beg me to release you from bonds that seemed like salvation when you were desperate, but feel like chains when you understand their true weight. Elena felt the depth of his loneliness through their connection. Centuries of isolation broken only by brief interludes with humans who ultimately could not accept the realities of his existence. Each rejection had reinforced his conviction that immortals and mortals were fundamentally incompatible, that offering protection to humans was ultimately an act of cruelty that created suffering for both parties. He was giving her the choice to become something that could truly be his equal, but his emotional state carried the certainty that she would eventually reject the price that equality demanded. Before Elena could respond to Adrian's offer, the supernatural bond carried information that made them both stiffen with alarm. The Vampire Council had arrived, ancient beings whose authority superseded even Adrian's considerable power within their society. Elena could sense their presence like pressure changes before a storm, old and implacable and utterly without human mercy or understanding. They had come to assess whether her continued existence represented an acceptable risk to vampire security, and their judgment would be final, regardless of Adrian's personal feelings or the sanctuary law he had invoked on her behalf. The trials began without ceremony or explanation, Elena finding herself subjected to tests that pushed her human limitations to their absolute breaking point. The first challenge involved resisting mental influence from vampires, whose glamour could convince humans to believe anything from false memories to complete personality changes. Elena discovered that her bond with Adrian provided some protection, but more importantly, she possessed a rare natural resistance to supernatural mental manipulation that surprised even the council members administering the test. The second trial required her to demonstrate that she could keep vampire secrets even under extreme duress, subjecting her to interrogation techniques that would have broken most human minds within minutes. But Elena's journalistic training had prepared her for hostile interviews and aggressive questioning, and her recent experience with Marcus's psychological manipulation had taught her to compartmentalize information and protect core truths, even when everything else was under attack. The final and most crucial test involved proving that her feelings for Adrian were genuine rather than simply Stockholm Syndrome or gratitude misinterpreted as affection. The council subjected her to magical examination that laid bare her emotional state with clinical precision, searching for evidence that her attachment was based on coercion or desperation rather than authentic connection. What they found surprised them, Elena realized through the supernatural bond. Emotions that ran deeper than simple gratitude or trauma-induced dependency. Recognition of Adrian's loneliness that matched her own, and genuine appreciation for his restraint and protection that had nothing to do with supernatural influence. But the trials also revealed the true cost of accepting Adrian's world fully. Requirements that Elena had not previously understood, despite the supernatural bond between them. Becoming immortal would mean abandoning every human relationship she had ever formed, cutting all ties to the mortal world she had known, in order to protect both realms from the complications that arose when immortals maintained ongoing connections to mortal affairs. Her father would have to believe her dead. Her few remaining friends would need to forget she had ever existed, and she would spend eternity knowing that everyone she had once cared about would age and die while she remained frozen at the moment of her transformation. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on Elena like physical force, making her understand why every other human Adrian had protected had eventually chosen to return to mortality, despite the dangers that choice entailed. The investigative report that arrived on Marcus's desk 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance contained information that should not have existed in any human database. The private security firm he had hired specialized in corporate espionage and finding people who did not want to be found, but their discovery of Adrian Dracule's true nature went far beyond anything Marcus had expected when he authorized unlimited resources for the investigation. The photographs showed Adrian in locations spanning decades without aging, financial records that traced back through centuries under various names, and most damning of all, security footage from the airport that revealed his complete absence from reflective surfaces. Marcus stared at the evidence spread across his mahogany desk and felt something like excitement coursing through his veins for the first time since Elena had escaped his control. He had always known that power came from information, that the right leverage could make anyone vulnerable regardless of their apparent strength or resources. Now he possessed information that could destroy someone who had clearly believed himself beyond human reach, evidence of something that challenged the fundamental assumptions most people held about the nature of reality itself. The supernatural investigators Marcus contacted through channels that existed in the shadows of legitimate research confirmed what the security firm had discovered and added layers of detail that made the scope of Adrian's true nature undeniable. Vampire, they told him, with the clinical detachment of experts discussing a particularly interesting specimen. Ancient, powerful, and according to our sources within certain occult communities, something close to royalty among his kind. The man who stole your wife is not human and has not been human for centuries. The leverage this information provided was intoxicating in ways that surpassed any business deal or financial conquest Marcus had ever achieved. He had Elena's protector at a disadvantage for the first time since she had fled their wedding, possessed knowledge that could expose not just Adrian, but potentially an entire hidden world that existed parallel to human society. The supernatural investigators had hinted at broader networks, ancient conspiracies, and shadow organizations that maintained the secrecy surrounding vampire existence through methods that made government cover-ups look like amateur operations. Marcus could destroy all of it with a single press release, could expose truths that would fundamentally reshape human understanding of their place in the world's hierarchical structure. The meeting he arranged took place in neutral territory, a private dining room at an exclusive restaurant where Marcus felt confident his human advantages of wealth and social connections would provide some protection against supernatural retaliation. He arrived with a team of bodyguards armed with weapons the occult investigators had assured him would be effective against vampires, silver bullets, and wooden stakes that seemed ridiculous, but which he carried anyway, as insurance against the impossible becoming deadly. Adrian appeared at the appointed time with the punctuality of someone who existed outside normal temporal constraints, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, but which could not disguise the predatory grace that marked him as something other than human. Marcus felt a thrill of satisfaction as he watched Adrian's dark eyes take in the prepared defenses, the armed guards positioned around the room, the evidence folders stacked neatly on the table between them. For the first time since Elena had vanished from their wedding reception, Marcus held the superior position in a negotiation. "You have something that belongs to me," Marcus said, settling back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that sufficient resources could not solve. "I want my wife back, and I am prepared to offer you a trade that I think you will find compelling." Adrian remained standing, his supernatural stillness more pronounced in the confined space of the dining room, and Marcus noticed that none of his bodyguards seemed able to look directly at the vampire for more than a few seconds at a time. The photographs and documentation spread across the table told a story that could destroy centuries of careful concealment, expose secrets that had been maintained through methods Marcus could only imagine. "Your existence, and the existence of others like you, depends on humanity remaining ignorant of your true nature," Marcus continued, enjoying the way Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am prepared to maintain that ignorance in exchange for Elena's immediate return to my custody. Refuse, and tomorrow morning every major news outlet in the world will receive copies of this evidence, along with my personal testimony about what I have discovered." The confrontation Marcus had anticipated did not materialize in the way he had expected. Adrian studied the evidence with the detached interest of someone reviewing a mildly interesting business proposal, showed no signs of the fear or desperation that Marcus had hoped to provoke. Instead, the vampire smiled with genuine amusement, revealing those two sharp teeth that the photographs had captured, but which were far more unsettling in person. "Elena is no longer your wife by any law that governs either of our peoples," Adrian said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate slightly. "She invoked sanctuary under protections older than your civilization, protections that your human legal system has no authority to override. But more importantly, she is here to speak for herself." The door to the private dining room opened to admit Elena, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed confidence falter as he took in the changes 3 weeks under vampire protection had wrought in his former wife. She moved with newfound grace that spoke of confidence rather than fear, wore expensive clothing that had clearly been chosen to emphasize strength rather than submission, and most disturbing of all, showed no trace of the controlled terror that had characterized their entire relationship. The woman who entered the room bore little resemblance to the trembling bride who had fled their wedding reception, and Marcus realized that whatever Adrian had done to her went far beyond simple protection or sanctuary. "Hello, Marcus," Elena said, settling into the chair across from him with composure that felt like a personal insult. "I understand you have been looking for me. The evidence you have gathered is quite impressive, though I suspect you do not fully understand the implications of what you have discovered." Marcus leaned forward, reasserting his authority through proximity and aggressive body language that had intimidated countless business rivals over the years. "The implications are simple, Elena. You belong to me legally and morally, and I want you back. Your supernatural friend here can either return you voluntarily or watch me destroy the secrecy that protects his entire species. I think the choice is obvious." Elena laughed, a sound that carried none of the nervous uncertainty Marcus remembered from their marriage. "Actually, the choice is mine," she said, and Marcus felt something cold forming in his stomach as he realized she was not responding to his threats with the fear he had expected. "You see, Marcus, while you have been gathering evidence about Adrian's true nature, I have been gathering evidence about yours. The information you plan to use as leverage cuts both ways. Elena opened a folder she had brought with her and spread photographs across the table that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. Pictures of him meeting with the men who had arranged her planned accident, recordings of phone conversations where he discussed her murder with the casual tone he used for stock trades, financial documents that traced the life insurance policies he had taken out on her without her knowledge. Every piece of evidence he would have needed to cover up her death was laid out between them. Proof of premeditated murder that would destroy him far more effectively than his vampire evidence could destroy Adrian. The irony was not lost on Marcus that Elena had used her journalistic training to investigate him with the same thoroughness he had used to investigate her protector, but where his evidence revealed supernatural secrets that most people would dismiss as elaborate hoaxes, her evidence documented human crimes that any prosecutor could understand and prove in court. "You planned to kill me," Elena said, her voice carrying steel that Marcus had never heard from her before, not in a moment of passion or rage, but as a calculated business decision designed to maximize your financial return on the investment you made in marrying me. That makes you not just an abusive husband, but a would-be murderer, and I have enough evidence to ensure that you spend the rest of your life in prison, regardless of your wealth or connections. Marcus felt the power dynamic shifting beneath him like unstable ground, his carefully planned leverage dissolving as Elena turned his own methods against him with surgical precision. But desperation made him dangerous in ways that rational self-interest would have prevented, and he reached for the gun his bodyguards had provided while shouting orders that would have summoned additional security if Elena had not anticipated his reaction. The weapon never cleared its holster before Adrian moved with supernatural speed that turned the vampire from statue to blur of motion in the space between heartbeats. Marcus found himself pressed against the wall with inhuman strength, his feet dangling inches above the floor, and his throat constricted by fingers that could have crushed his windpipe without effort. The predatory grace that had seemed merely unsettling from a distance became terrifying when directed at him with focused intensity, and Marcus realized that all his preparations and weapons were useless against something that moved faster than human reflexes could track. This was the moment Elena had dreaded, the confrontation that would force her to choose between allowing Adrian to eliminate Marcus with supernatural violence or finding a solution that preserved both worlds' secrets. She could sense Adrian's hunger through their bond, could feel the predatory satisfaction that came from finally being able to act without restraint against someone who had threatened what he protected. Marcus deserved whatever fate Adrian chose to inflict, but his death by supernatural means would create exactly the kind of exposure that both species needed to avoid. "Stop," Elena said, her voice carrying authority she had not known she possessed. "He is not worth compromising everything you have spent centuries protecting. Let me handle this the human way." Adrian released Marcus, who collapsed to the floor gasping and clutching his throat, but the vampire's dark eyes remained fixed on Elena with an intensity that spoke of barely controlled violence. Through their bond, she could feel his willingness to defer to her judgment, warring with instincts that demanded immediate elimination of the threat Marcus represented. Elena looked down at her former husband cowering on the expensive carpet and felt something like pity mixing with her disgust and anger. "You have two choices, Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the supernatural tension crackling through the room. "You can destroy yourself trying to expose secrets that will only make you look insane, while I provide evidence of your crimes to every prosecutor in the country, or you can disappear quietly and permanently, while I ensure that your evidence never sees the light of day. Take your bodyguards, take your money, and find somewhere very far away to live out whatever life you have left. If I ever see you again, if you ever try to contact me or anyone I care about, I will make sure that every detail of your planned murder becomes public knowledge." The choice Elena made in that moment went beyond simply sparing Marcus's life or protecting vampire secrecy. She was choosing to claim her own power, to solve problems through her own skills and judgment, rather than relying on Adrian's supernatural abilities. The transformation from victim to equal partner happened not through magical ritual, but through the recognition that she possessed strengths that complemented Adrian's immortal power, that their partnership could be built on mutual respect rather than protection and dependence. Marcus took the offer, gathering his evidence and his bodyguards and fleeing the restaurant with the speed of someone who finally understood that he had encountered forces beyond his ability to control or manipulate. Elena watched him go and felt the last chains of her old life falling away, replaced not with new bondage, but with freely chosen commitment to a future she could barely comprehend but was ready to embrace fully. The transformation began at sunset in Adrian's private chambers, a space that existed between worlds, just as Elena herself was learning to exist between mortality and immortality. She had expected pain, drama, the gothic theatricality that centuries of vampire literature had embedded in human imagination. Instead, she found herself lying on silk sheets, while Adrian's ancient blood worked through her system with the efficiency of medicine designed by beings who had perfected the process across millennia of careful practice. Her human memories remained intact, crystalline clear in ways that surprised her, but they were now overlaid with supernatural awareness that allowed her to perceive layers of reality she had never suspected existed. The bond between herself and Adrian deepened into something beyond emotional connection, becoming a sharing of consciousness that maintained their individual personalities while creating unprecedented intimacy between two beings who had both spent lifetimes believing themselves fundamentally alone. Through Adrian's memories flowing into her transformed mind, Elena experienced glimpses of the centuries he had lived, the careful balance he had maintained between vampire and human worlds, the isolation that had defined his existence until she stumbled into his awareness, wrapped in torn wedding silk and desperate courage. But more than passive absorption of his experiences, Elena found herself contributing her own perspective to their shared consciousness, offering human insight into immortal problems and journalistic objectivity to supernatural politics that had been conducted in the same patterns for countless generations. The transformation completed itself without fanfare, marked not by dramatic revelation, but by the simple recognition that Elena now existed as something new, neither fully vampire nor entirely human, but a bridge between worlds that had been kept separate through necessity and fear. Her reflection in the antique mirror showed her own face unchanged, but somehow more present, more solid, as if she had spent her mortal life existing as a pale copy of herself, and only now achieved full reality. The supernatural gifts that came with immortality felt like natural extensions of abilities she had always possessed, but never fully accessed. Enhanced perception and mental acuity that made her previous human limitations seem like deliberate handicaps, rather than natural boundaries. Adrian watched her adjustment to immortal existence with wonder that transcended his centuries of experience, marveling at how she retained her moral compass and human empathy, despite the predatory instincts that vampire transformation typically awakened. Where other humans he had protected had been overwhelmed by the hunger and power that came with immortality, Elena integrated these new aspects of herself with the same pragmatic determination that had allowed her to escape Marcus's control. She approached vampire politics with journalistic curiosity, studied the supernatural community's laws and customs with the thoroughness of someone preparing to write an investigative series, and began developing ideas for how the careful separation between worlds might be softened without compromising the safety of either species. The Vampire Council, initially skeptical of Adrian's decision to transform a human, found themselves impressed by Elena's ability to navigate their complex social hierarchies while maintaining independence of thought that challenged centuries of established precedent without threatening fundamental stability. Her suggestions for improving communication between vampire and human authorities were dismissed as impossible until she demonstrated their practical applications through carefully orchestrated incidents that protected supernatural secrecy while preventing human tragedies that immortal intervention could easily address. Within months of her transformation, Elena had established herself as something unprecedented in vampire society, a bridge between worlds who could speak to both species with authority and understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries that kept them separate. Her journalistic background proved invaluable in documenting supernatural history that had been maintained only through oral tradition, creating written records that preserved knowledge while establishing protocols for sharing information safely between vampire and human institutions. The work gave her purpose that extended far beyond personal survival or romantic attachment, allowing her to use her immortal existence to protect others who found themselves caught between worlds they could not fully comprehend. Adrian discovered that partnership with an equal transformed his own existence in ways he had not anticipated, replacing the isolated responsibility of vampire kingship with shared purpose that made centuries of accumulated wisdom feel fresh and relevant again. Together, they developed new approaches to the ancient problems that had defined vampire society, creating systems that honored tradition while adapting to modern realities that required more sophisticated responses than simple concealment and avoidance. The airport where Elena's transformation from victim to survivor had begun became a place of pilgrimage for them both, a location that symbolized the courage required to choose unknown futures over familiar suffering. They returned there often, not from nostalgia, but from recognition that airports existed as spaces between destinations where people made decisions that would define the trajectories of their entire lives. Elena could now sense the desperation that radiated from certain travelers, could identify through supernatural perception the ones who were running from cages rather than simply traveling between locations. The ability to recognize courage under duress had become one of her most valuable gifts, allowing her to identify humans who possessed the rare combination of strength and desperation that made them candidates for supernatural protection. On this particular evening, 6 months after her transformation, Elena sat on the same bench where Adrian had first covered her sleeping form with his coat and offered wordless comfort to a stranger in wedding white. The airport looked exactly the same, all bright lighting and constant motion, but Elena's perception now revealed layers of meaning and possibility that her human senses had been too limited to detect. She could sense the emotional states of every person within 100 yards, could identify the difference between ordinary travel stress and the bone-deep terror that characterized someone fleeing for their life. Adrian joined her on the bench, moving with the silence that no longer seemed supernatural, but simply part of his nature. And together, they watched the late evening crowd navigate the space between departures and arrivals. Through their shared consciousness, Elena felt his contentment, the peace that had replaced centuries of isolation now that he had found someone who could truly understand the responsibilities that came with immortal power. They no longer hid in shadows, but sat openly among the humans they protected, guardians who had learned that true strength came not from concealment, but from the willingness to act when action was needed. The desperate young man Elena sensed near the departure gates radiated the same combination of fear and determination that she remembered feeling during her own flight from Marcus's control. He moved through the terminal with the careful paranoia of someone who expected pursuit, checking reflective surfaces for followers and positioning himself where he could monitor multiple exit routes simultaneously. His clothes were expensive but rumpled. His face carried the hollow look of someone who had not slept properly in days, and his hands shook with the fine tremor that came from adrenaline sustained too long without relief. Elena touched Adrian's mind through their bond, sharing her perception of the young man's distress and her recognition of the courage that had brought him to this place of transition. Adrian nodded, understanding passing between them without need for words. And Elena rose from the bench to approach someone who needed help, whether he realized it or not. The intervention they offered would be subtle, she knew, limited by the same laws of consent and invitation that had governed Adrian's initial protection of her. But they could provide options, could ensure that someone brave enough to choose freedom over security would not have to face the consequences of that choice entirely alone. Elena's reflection in the terminal's glass walls showed her standing beside Adrian, two figures who cast clear reflections despite their supernatural nature, visible and present and committed to using their immortal existence to protect those who possess the courage to save themselves. The airport that had once been her sanctuary now served as their base of operations, a space between worlds where they could identify and assist humans who were ready to trade familiar suffering for unknown possibility. Together, they had found purpose that transcended personal happiness or romantic fulfillment, had discovered that true partnership meant using combined strengths to protect others rather than simply protecting each other. The vampire king, who had spent centuries believing himself fundamentally incompatible with human connection, had learned that isolation was a choice, rather than an inevitable consequence of immortal nature. While the journalist who had nearly been destroyed by human predators had discovered that supernatural power could be used to create safety, rather than simply impose control. Their love story had become something larger than romance, evolving into a shared mission that would define how they spent eternity together. As Elena approached the desperate young man near the departure gate, she felt Adrian's presence supporting her through their bond, felt the weight of responsibility they shared for maintaining the delicate balance between protection and freedom that made their intervention possible. She was no longer running from anything but moving toward purpose she could never have imagined when she collapsed on that airport bench in her torn wedding dress. The cage she had fled had been replaced not with a new prison, but with unlimited space to grow into whatever she chose to become. And she had chosen to become someone who helped others find the courage to make the same escape she had once thought impossible.